So, some of you probably know who Leanne Tui is. If not by name, then as the woman played by the actress Sandra Bullock in the movie The Blind Side, if you remember that movie. It told the real-life story of how Miss Tui's family, which is white, adopted the future Baltimore Ravens offensive tackle football player Michael Oher, who was black. They adopted him when he was in high school and sort of struggling with the after effects of a troubled childhood. And it's a heartwarming story of kind of Southern sassiness and love and family overcoming all obstacles. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's a good movie. Sandra Bullock won an Oscar for it. So this past December, Mrs. Tui posted the following message on her Facebook page. And it was accompanied by a photo of herself kind of posing with two black teenagers, one on either side. And she posted this. She said, "We see what we want. It's the gospel truth. These two," meaning the teenagers, "were literally huddled over in a corner table, nose to nose, and the person with me said, 'I bet they are up to no good.' Well, you know me," she continues. "I walked over, told them to scoot over. After 10 seconds of dead silence, I said, 'So what's happening at this table?' I get nothing. I then explained it was my store and they should spill it. They showed me their phones and they were texting friends trying to scrape up $3 each for the high school basketball game. Well, they left with smiles, money for popcorn and bus fare." She continues, "We have to stop judging people and assuming and pigeonholing people. Don't judge a book by its cover or however you'd like to express the sentiment. Accept others and stop seeing what you want to see." Now, because Mrs. Tui is sort of a semi-celebrity, this post made its way around the internet pretty quickly, sort of generally receiving accolades for its sort of positive message, until it was suggested by some that what was actually being related here, this was actually the story, less a heartwarming story about acceptance and more of a sort of textbook case of racial profiling. You've got these two black teenagers in a restaurant. They're minding their own business. They're engaged in perfectly lawful behavior. When Tui's friend suggests, we don't know why, that they are probably up to no good. Whereupon Tui, who is white, invades their space, asserts her authority as the owner of her store, and interrogates them, even going so far as to review the contents of their cell phones. Then she takes a picture of them to show the world that these are all good kids, and they are all three having a good time. One of the teenagers is indeed smiling for the camera, and the other one, well, if I ever want to paint a portrait of discomfort, I now have my reference photo. The most ambiguous expression I have ever seen. Okay, now Mrs. Tui has not asked my opinion of this event, and I seriously doubt that she cares. But my read on this is that by all appearances, Mrs. Tui is a kind and well-intentioned person with a very good heart, who firmly believes in judging people by what's on the inside, and who abhors prejudice, and who, after all, has a black son, and who, nonetheless, did something in the end that was very problematic and probably racist. And these things are not mutually exclusive. So, today is the first part of a two-part sermon series on racial inequality in America. And of course, I could give a 10-part sermon series on racial inequality in America and not say everything that could be said, right? I mean, this topic is so vast and so multifaceted and it so permeates our lives. But we're not going to do that. So today, for these next two sermons, I just want to pick out some ideas that I want to highlight for reflection and discussion. Next week, we're going to talk about the history and the institutions that created and sustained this racial inequality that we find in America. And of course, it's a history of deliberately imposed white supremacy, right? We have a racist society today, or a racially unequal society today, because at different points in our past, people with power decided that that was what they wanted, and they imposed that society, and they did it with brutal violence, and they did it through our systems of government, and they did it with a very explicit crude racial ideology that supported it, right? I mean, we all know this history. And in general, the majority white population accepted this propaganda and they bought into the system. So that's the story that we're going to tell next week. And of course, people, both black and white, also rebelled against that system. And they rejected that crude ideology, and they rejected that propaganda. And they fought against slavery, and they fought against Jim Crow, and they won important victories. So that's also the story that we're going to be telling next week. And yet, despite those victories, the system of white supremacy and its effect, which is racial inequality, is still very much alive and well in America. And this week, I wanted to talk about some of the ways in which racism doesn't really require that crude propaganda, that crude ideology anymore. Racism doesn't require racists to propagate itself in the sense that we understand sort of the classic image of what a racist is. People who hate black people because they're black. People who have an ideology that says black people or not white people are inferior. Or people who consciously want the state to sponsor white dominance, right? That's sort of classically what you think of as being a racist. And officially, that kind of racism is on the way out. There's a book called Racism Without Racists by Eduardo Bonilla-Silva. And he talks about how polling data since the 70s has consistently shown that that person, that caricature of a racist white person, is on his way or her way out. The racial attitudes of white people are improving. And as a nation, our official rhetoric is that we have signed on to Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of a colorblind society, where people are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And our public statements and our public dialogue, for the most part, echoes that dream. But here's the complication. Bonilla-Silva makes the case, and I think it has become very evident since the events in Ferguson, that the new rhetoric of color blindness that we've accepted as a nation and that we use when we talk about race, this new idea that the ideal person doesn't see color, can also be a mask for a much more subtle kind of racism, and can be used very effectively by people who have a vested interest in the racial status quo, which often, but not exclusively, means white people, to block progress that might be measured in terms of real changes in the distribution of wealth and power that might actually make a difference in black people's lives. Okay, this colorblind ideology can be used to block real change that might make a real difference. Because making those changes requires us to focus on race and talk about race and acknowledge the harms that were done in the name of race and the harms that are still being done in the names of race. And then to correct those harms, we might even have to factor race into our decisions about how we're going to do things. But this violates the new colorblind ideology, which says it's retrograde and harmful, and maybe it's even racist to talk about race. And so, in this new rhetoric, since we're all sort of anxious to declare that racism is all in the past, that we're a post-racial society now, we have a black president now, it can be used to silence black people by suggesting almost that racism would go away if people would just stop talking about it, right? By talking about it, you're perpetuating it, so just stop talking about it. And the other side of this is that because this new ideology defines racism essentially as having racial thoughts, i.e. it's about the contents of our heads rather than the shape of our lives, it gives people, often white people, but not exclusively, a cover under which we can sort of passively acquiesce to our own role in social order that is still very racist, very much about white supremacy, without us having to take any responsibility for it. Because however racially driven the facts of your life might appear to be, white friends, white coworkers, white neighborhood, white schools, white stores, white privilege, you can repeat the mantra of, oh, I don't see color, and be absolved. Okay, so again, this is a huge topic to talk about, And I've been speaking very generally so far, so I want to get a little more specific. So today I just want to focus on three ways that one can perpetuate racial inequality without having to be racist in the sense of having explicitly racist thoughts in your head. There are more than three ways, but we're just looking at three. Okay, so the first way is to deny that racism exists. The second way is to focus on our own good intentions as being what matters. And the third way, which is the easiest of them all, is to do nothing and wait for time to sort of fix these problems. And we're going to take these one at a time. The first way, and this is the big one, so we're going to spend most of our time talking about this one. The first way that we can help sustain racial inequality is to deny the reality of racism, or deny that racism currently has more than a trivial impact on black people's lives, right? That it's not just like an unpleasant experience, like maybe someone made an offensive joke at the water cooler and you had to listen to it, but that it's actually creating lost opportunities and bad outcomes for non-white people. We know that racism is still very much operative in American life. And the studies are there, and there are a lot of different examples of it. In one study, they sent out fictitious resumes to entry-level positions. They were completely identical, except that one of them had a stereotypically white name, and one of them had a stereotypically black name. And the white resume got a gajillion times more callbacks. That's not, specific there. That's not precise in my statistics, but a gajillion more callbacks. And in fact, the black resume got the same level of callbacks as a white resume with a nonviolent felony conviction added to it. So having a black-sounding name is equivalent, in this case, to having a nonviolent felony conviction in terms of getting people to offer you a job. In a related study, a Wharton School of Business study, they sent a made-up letter to like 6,500 professors at 250 top universities. And it was an email supposedly written by a student just asking to meet the professor for a mentoring opportunity. And that's how things happen in college, right? You connect with a professor, they mentor you, they throw resources your way, they put you on committees, and that's how it works. So they sent the exact same fake letter to every professor, but they just changed the name so that it seemed to be coming from a student of a different gender or race. And what they found is that it vastly impacted the difference in the willingness of professors to respond, in some cases by 25% or more. A couple other impactful studies. An American Psychological study showed that, American Psychological Association study showed that after the age of 10, black children are perceived to be significantly older than they are, as many as 4.5 years older, and to be judged to have an older child's level of moral responsibility for their actions. That means they are more deserving of punishment for their actions than a white child of the same age, because they're less protected by the sort of aura of childhood innocence. After the age of 10, they're judged to be less innocent. And we know that black children are punished more often, and punished more severely for the same offenses in schools, and that this sets up worse educational outcomes and worse behavior outcomes, and it helps create what some are now calling the school-to-prison pipeline. So we know that that's out there. We know that black teenagers use drugs about as much as white teenagers, but are in some cases 6 to 8 times more likely to be arrested for the same behavior, and they get worse sentences when they do. So we know about that, right? We know this stuff is happening. But paradoxically, despite this widespread, well-documented existence of unequal treatment associated with race, which is something that people more than ever in American history are saying we do not want. We do not want this unequal treatment. But this new colorblind ideology actually makes it easier for people to deny the existence of racism when it happens. That's the paradox. And the first way it does this is it guarantees that most of the time racism, when it happens, is going to be pretty subtle. Because it's not socially acceptable in most settings anymore to just act blatantly racist. You can't do that, right? You can't put up a sign that says, we don't hire black people here. You can't say, I believe I would go out and profile this morning, right? You can't do that. So when racism happens, it's going to be subtle. The person person may not even be aware of their own prejudice. But if the racism is deliberate, it's going to be what many sociologists call racism with a smiling face. Racism with a smiling face. And racism without racists. Bonilla Silva relates a study of lending practices undertaken by the Kentucky Human Rights Commission. And how that works is they send people out to apply for mortgages, and the only difference is one is white and one is black, and they check their experiences, right? So black and white testers with equal characteristics requested conventional mortgages for the same housing from 10 of the top lending institutions in Louisville. In the 85 visits made to inquire about loans, none of the black testers, with one exception, knew that they were being discriminated against, though all of them, in fact, were discriminated against. Blacks were given less information, less encouragement to return and apply, fewer hints as to how to successfully obtain a loan, and differential treatment in pre-qualifying. Sometimes being told they would not qualify when whites of similar profiles were told that they would. So the black testers themselves did not realize that they were being discriminated against. That's how subtle this is, and yet all of them were discriminated against in some fashion. And housing discrimination can have huge, impactful, cascading effects on your life. Right? There was a November 2013 This American Life talking about housing discrimination. And reporter Nicole Hannah-Jones noted that for every measure of well-being and opportunity, the foundation is where you live. Right? It affects every part of your life. The quality of your schools and hospitals, cancer rates, asthma rates, infant mortality, unemployment, education, access to food, down to whether or not the city repairs your roads. So the This American Life broadcast followed two women, one black and one white, who were employed as testers, right, to go out and look for instances of housing discrimination. In this case, in New York City. So they would go out and inquire about availability for apartments in the same building. They had fake profiles that were identical except for the race of the two women. And the black woman, whose name is Karen, relates the impact for her of discovering that she was in fact discriminated against, in a case where she had no inkling it had happened. Immediately after telling Karen that nothing was available, the superintendent turned around and rented an apartment to a white woman, the white tester with the identical profile. And Karen says in the story, "I was surprised, and I was like, but he was so nice to me. Not, he was cordial. He wasn't throwing me a party, but he was cordial. He wasn't rushing me out. And I was completely taken off guard. When he told me nothing was available, I took him at face value." Okay, so colorblind ideology can paradoxically encourage people to deny racism when it happens, because on the one hand, the racism is so subtle, and then on the other hand, the ideology says that racism is so objectionable and so unacceptable that we're reluctant to accuse someone of it when it might be happening, right? We don't want to think something so bad about someone else who we may kind of know, we may kind of like, they may be in a position of authority, they may seem like a nice person, and we don't want to believe it about them. And we certainly don't want to accuse someone of something so awful with such little evidence, but because it's so subtle, the evidence is not going to be there. So what happens is that our desire to be fair, which is a perfectly reasonable desire to have, right, leads us or can lead us to disregard what black people are telling us about their own experiences and what life is really like for them. It can lead black people themselves to question their own experiences. In the case of Karen, our black female tester, she reported in the story that the whole experience threw her into an emotional tailspin that lasted for years. She said, "For a while I had a feeling of like, what does that mean I'm misjudging other people in my life?" And she says, "I question a lot of my judgment, my thought processes, even my interactions with friends, people I've known for years. How do you really think of me? What do you really think of me?" And even when people accept that racism is happening in the abstract, they can still deny every given instance of it. Again, because of this subtlety and this desire to be fair. Yes, I know that racism exists in employment, but I don't really think that your boss was doing that. Yes, I know that driving while black is a thing, but honestly, I don't really think that's why that cop pulls you over. Right? And the black people who suspect that they have been discriminated against may find themselves being accused of being too sensitive, of trying to make everything about race. You're always making everything about race. Of having a chip on their shoulder, of having a victim mentality, of playing the race card. I've probably read each of those phrases 1,000 times reading comments about events in Ferguson. They can even be accused of being mentally unbalanced. The MMPI, which is the most widely recognized personality diagnostic tool. For example, all prospective union ministers are required to take this test, right, to gauge your psyche. The MMPI is known to overdiagnose black people as paranoid. There's another way you can be discriminated against. This test will tell people you're paranoid. But is it paranoia when people really are watching you, right? They really are following you around in stores. They really are calling the police. There's this person out there. Okay, so we can we got our 3 steps, right, for propagating racism without being racist. And the first was we can deny the reality of racism, or accept it but deny every instance of racism because it wears a smiling face. That was step 1. The second way that we can propagate a racist system without being racist is to overly rely on our own good intentions when navigating these issues, right? Because for the most part, we do have good intentions, and we know our own hearts. We feel that we're good people and we're non-racist people. But the reality is, we are all of us tangled up in a racist system. And we are all products of a racist history and a racist culture. And so inevitably, we're going to say or do things that fall short of our ideals, that fall short of how we think we would like to behave or what we would like to have said or done. We're going to make mistakes, which is fine. The question is, how do we deal with that when it happens? How do we recover from our mistakes, especially if we're called out on them? And colorblind ideology, because its emphasis is on the purity of our thoughts and feelings, can trip us up by encouraging us to be either defensive or in denial about our mistakes. I know I don't have racist thoughts, and that's what racism is, right? It's a thought in my head, and I know that thought is not there. I know I don't have racist intentions. I know the goodness of my own intentions, and that's what racism is. So therefore, if you take something I say the wrong way, you are being oversensitive, or you're being mean, or you're just making everything about race. That's what I think tripped up Leanne Tui in her opening story. Maybe she might have thought twice about what she was about to do approaching these 2 black kids, but she knew her own heart. And she knew that she wasn't profiling these kids because that's not who she is. And when people suggested that maybe this wasn't what was happening, wasn't really what you think was happening, her defenders, again, focused on her intentions, focused on her good heart, that this could not be racist because it was not accompanied by a racist intent. But if we believe that racism is not a state of mind, that racism is a system that lives and is embodied in our environment, and in our institutions, and in our relationships, and our history, and our habits, and yes, sometimes also our thoughts, then we can be less focused on our mental states, and more focused on the totality of our impact on one another. And when we screw up, rather than turn on our good intentions as a defense and an excuse, we can try to acknowledge, yes, you know what, I fell short. I embodied racism in a way that I don't ever wish to repeat, and how can I learn from this? And then those of us who are white can more easily hear people of color when they say, you know what, this is how your words actually sound, or this is how your actions are actually affecting me. It's a difficult thing to hear, but if we don't get so caught up on talking about our intentions, we can more easily hear it and respond. Third way that we can help propagate a racist system without harboring racist thoughts or feelings, this is the easiest way of all. We can do nothing. That's it. We can just do nothing. We can let time fix this problem. Because after all, the really serious racism, the slavery, the Jim Crow, the redlining, the legal discrimination, that's all in the past, right? We have laws against that stuff now. And of course, prejudiced people still exist, yeah, but you can't come right out and say it, and we know from the polling data that it's going away, and it's not racist TV shows on TV. So it's all of that stuff is going away, right? So that means that if we have equality of opportunity, legal opportunity, and racism is on the wane in our culture, then we can just kind of let time and the marketplace take care of this, right? We just wait it out, it's getting better, and it'll just fix itself over time. Okay. And this is really just a subject for next week's sermon. But just to give you a heads up, the answer is no. No, we can't. Just wait and let it fix itself. Because racial inequality is, in many ways, very persistent, and it's not very tractable. By a lot of measures that we care about, like school segregation, wealth inequality, unemployment, rates of incarceration, downward generational mobility, things are getting more unequal, not less unequal. And there's plenty of evidence that we actually can't rely on mechanisms like the marketplace or education to fix these problems for us. Not that there's anything wrong with the marketplace, not that education isn't a great thing, but they're not going to do what we want them to do as it relates to this issue. Okay. So those are the three ways that you can help propagate a racist system while staying safely within a colorblind ideology. Deny that racism exists, or at least any specific act of racism exists. Fall back on your good intentions when called out. And when all else fails, do nothing. And a colorblind ideology helps us say, if we're made a little uncomfortable about maybe something we've said or done or a situation that's happening, why you gotta always make everything about race. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr., when he gave his I Have a Dream speech, he never intended it to be used to silence black people. He never intended it to be used to silence the voice of justice or to give a cloak of respectability to a racist system that is still very much with us. And we can't get to there by pretending that we're already there, because we're not. What we can do is insist that black voices are heard. We can honor the truth of black experiences, and we can make the fight for the inherent worth and dignity of all people more important than anyone's desire to be comfortable, than anyone's desire to be done hearing about race. It was a long march from Selma to Montgomery. It's a long road ahead of us too. May we be faithful and courageous companions on the journey. Our closing hymn is number 121. We'll build a land in your great hymnal. Would you please rise in body or spirit?